In the year 68 CE, the Roman Empire is close to its peak in terms of territory and power. Stretching from Britain in the northwest all the way around the Mediterranean to Egypt in the southeast. A single dynasty of emperors has ruled from the seat of power in Rome for nearly 100 years, from Augustus all the way to Nero. Despite this, rebellions have sprung up, while Emperor Nero desperately clings onto power. But in the face of being named a public enemy of the Roman state by the Senate, as well as Galba marching on Rome, he commits suicide. With him, the first Roman dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, ended. With Nero ousted, hope is high among the Roman population. There is optimism that the new Emperor Galba will bring a certain level of normality back. Despite this, he was viewed as a temporary stopgap, as he was in his early 70s and had no children as heirs. But perhaps no one expected him and the next two emperors to be as temporary as they became. Because of this, we know the following year, 69 CE, as the year of the four emperors, culminating in an entirely new dynasty with no familial ties to the former rulers. No piece of history exists in a vacuum. So to get to the year of the four emperors, we must first set the stage for the events leading up to 69 CE. Nero is, next to Caligula, perhaps the most notorious and infamous Roman emperor, thanks in large part to his poor attitude towards and bad treatment of the Senate, from whose perspective a lot of the historical sources we rely on view the world, as well as his scapegoating and persecution of Christians following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Compiling together the story of the year 69 CE is an old-fashioned exercise in source criticism. A great deal of the notorious events committed by Nero come from biased sources and, as with any other historical source, should be scrutinized. One example is the death of his wife Poppaea, supposedly being caused by Nero repeatedly kicking her himself or ordering his servants to do so, as well as the fantastical and contradicting stories surrounding Nero's murder of his mother Agrippina. That being said though, it's no secret that Nero's relationship with the upper classes of Rome were contentious even at the best of times. The man who would set into motion the dominoes that would eventually lead to Nero's end was Julius Vindex, a Romanized Gaul in charge of the province of Gallia Lugdunensis, modern-day central France. Resentment against Nero as emperor had been festering for years, perhaps most notoriously seen in the failed Pisonian conspiracy in 65 CE, which was an attempt by several members of the Senate and other portions of the upper classes of Rome to depose Nero. Sometime during the winter of 67-68 CE, Vindex began sending off letters to neighboring governors and military commanders in an attempt to win support from them to start a revolt against Nero. Vindex never put forth himself as a candidate to replace Nero, nor did he name anyone else. Perhaps so he could maximize the opportunities to find someone interested in and with the power and an ancestry to take the role. According to the Roman statesman and historian Cassius Dio, Vindex proclaimed that
he, Nero, has despoiled the whole Roman world, because he has destroyed all the flower of their senate, because he debauched and likewise killed his mother, and does not preserve even the semblance of sovereignty.
Dio also asserted that Vindex was an intelligent man, and it's therefore natural to assume that Vindex would suspect that some of the men he corresponded with would inform Nero of his intentions. He could thus only make one of two choices. He could go ahead with the revolt, or he could commit suicide. In March of 68 CE, he raised the standard of revolt, and found out to his despair that his support was limited to only 3 out of 64 tribes in Gaul: the Aedui, the Arverni, and the Sequani, totaling supposedly 100,000 men. This gave the uprising an appearance of a Gallic insurrection against its Roman overlords, rather than a united revolt against Nero's tyranny. Among the letters Vindex had sent out over the winter was Servius Sulpicius Galba, who had kept his silence and not reported him to Nero, nor for that matter replied to Vindex's communications. At the time, the aged Galba was serving as governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. In an attempt to get the revolt back on track, Vindex invited Galba to become the leader. If we're to believe Plutarch, it was with the urging of his associate Titus Vinius that Galba accepted in early April. Suetonius, however, claims that Galba had another motive, that he had learned of secret instructions sent to his procurators to kill him. The legitimacy of these claims are uncertain, as they're more than likely Galba's attempts at portraying himself as a victim of the tyrant Nero. As he was hailed as emperor by an assembled crowd in Nova Carthago, Galba criticized Nero and pointed out the vast number of men who had been exiled or murdered by him, and went on to proclaim himself as a lieutenant of the Senate and people of Rome. After his declaration, Galba began to raise troops in his territories, mustering up a second legion and thus doubling on paper the total number of troops under his direct command. What he did not do, however, was march to the aid of Vindex, who to start with had to lay siege to his own provincial capital of Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon. The internal revolt of Lugdunum should have come as no surprise, as the citizens had contributed greatly to the coffers to help with the rebuilding of Rome after the Great Fire of 64 CE. Nero had returned to them the same sum after Lugdunum had suffered from a great fire the following year. Vindex then more than likely assumed one of two things: that the provincial capital would not deny entry to its own governor and thus did not plan for any trickery to attempt to take the city, or he deliberately gave Lugdunum the chance to show his hostility and to use it as a means of increasing his support elsewhere in the region, as was the case with Vienna, who joined Vindex's cause. As Vindex laid siege to Lugdunum, the governor of Upper Germania, Lucius Virginius Rufus, began mustering his own forces to put down the revolt. Eager by the promise of Gallic loot, a substantial greater booty than that of punitive raids into Germania, as well as fueled by Roman pride, 2 of Virginius's legions moved out towards the end of March. When they arrived at Vesontio, the capital of one of Vindex's allies, the Sequani, they were refused entry, and Virginius was forced to lay siege to the city. Vindex, meanwhile, had no choice but to come to the aid of his allies. However, the prospect of a serious fight meant that a large mass of supporters fled and abandoned the revolt. With the addition of having to leave some of his own troops to continue their own siege of Lugdunum, Vindex arrived at Vesontio with merely 30,000 men at the end of April. However, instead of immediately attempting to break the siege, the two sides began parleying, and eventually the two leaders conferred together without any outside witnesses. During this meeting, supposedly they agreed to join forces against Nero. According to Cassius Dio, who doesn't specify for what reason, Vindex then ordered his men to march into Vesontio and take possession of it. Observing this and interpreting it as a sign of an imminent battle, Virginius's men attacked without waiting for orders. The details of the battle itself are sparse, and we are left nearly 2,000 years later having to guess as to Virginius's motivations, or if he knew at all what would take place. Regardless of that, at the end of the battle, upwards of 20,000 Gauls are said to have been killed, and Vindex himself committed suicide in despair. At this point, Virginius's troops took it upon themselves to proclaim him as emperor. However, he rejected their proclamations. Virginius had been granted his military command in large part due to his mediocrity, and he would be treated as such by the next 6 emperors. However, it should also be noted that he outlived 5 of those, and upon his death he was given an official eulogy by the historian and consul at the time, Tacitus. So maybe he was painfully aware of his own shortcomings, or perhaps he was merely caught off guard and unable to manipulate the situation to his own advantage. Considering what would happen over the next year, he might have done well to stay out of the line of fire. Some historians have proclaimed that this was Virginius' moment to play kingmaker, and that he failed to stack the deck in his favor, by neither supporting Galba nor making a case for himself, though for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which was his lack of ancestry as a first-generation senator at a time when the empire still valued such things. By default, his actions supported Nero. I would argue that Virginius perhaps did not even recognize such a moment, and more importantly, at this point in time, a much larger portion of the Senate was willing to keep Nero as emperor than would be prudent to admit not many months later. What is of more interest, both for this moment in time and the near future, beyond Virginius' refusal, is the act of the soldiers declaring him as emperor. Without context, it sounds as if the soldiers of the Rhine, or more likely self-invested officers, were revolting against Nero. However, once Virginius refused their offer, as well as refusing to back Galba, the men immediately returned to their allegiances. Their motivation was more than likely against Galba, not Nero. This was because of the history between Galba and the legions of Upper Germania, which we'll come back to next time. Upon receiving no confirmation or having been rejected from Virginius to his offer of joining forces, the ancient sources do not give us this insight, Galba withdrew into his territory and allegedly was contemplating joining Vindex in suicide before being discouraged by the men in his inner circle. Galba might have had the trappings of an emperor, though he still considered himself as a lieutenant of the Senate and people of Rome, but his severe lack of military support limited his options. Meanwhile, rumors were no doubt circulating in Rome as to Virginius' plans. After Vindex's death, instead of returning to their postings along the Rhine, his legions remained encamped in Gaul. The likeliest scenario is that Virginius was merely content with pacifying the Gallic tribes. However, it could easily be misconstrued that Virginius was making a play, or perhaps even joining Galba's side. Up until this point, Nero had failed to take the threat of the revolt seriously. Cassius Dio claims that
Nero was informed of the Vindex episode as he was in Naples, viewing the gymnastic contest just after luncheon. He was naturally far from sorry. He did not hurry back to Rome, but merely sent a letter to the Senate in which he asked them to regard leniently his non-arrival, because he had a sore throat, implying that when he did come, he wanted to sing to them.
But upon being informed of Galba joining, as well as the rumors of Virginius' possible betrayal,
Nero fell into great fear. He made preparations in person at Rome, and he sent against the rebels Rubrius Gallus and some others.
it was at this point that another important player entered the fray. Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, who would make the decisive move that would finally topple Nero. Nymphidius was in 68 CE one of 2 prefects of the Praetorian Guard, the military unit serving as, among other things, the emperor's personal bodyguards. At the time, the other prefect was, for unclear reasons, out of the picture, which left Nymphidius as effectively the only prefect and in full control of the Praetorian Guard. Observing the current situation, Nymphidius decided to seize the opportunity to put Galba into his debt. On the night of the 9th of June, Nymphidius made his move. He claimed that they, the Praetorian Guard, were not deserting the emperor. Instead, Nero had abandoned and deserted them and embarked on a ship to Alexandria. In addition to this, Nymphidius also promised the men, in Galba's name, a donative of 7,500 denarii each, a hefty sum equal to about 10 years' wages and double what Claudius and Nero had gifted upon them becoming emperor. With the Praetorian Guard convinced to abandon Nero, the Senate were encouraged to declare him an enemy of the state, in addition to formally proclaiming Galba as their new emperor later that same day. Nero fled to the country villa of Phaon, one of his freedmen, a formerly enslaved person, a few miles outside of Rome. After much hesitation, he steeled himself to commit suicide by stabbing a dagger into his own throat. Famously, some of Nero's last words were said to have been,
"Qualis artifex pereo, what an artist dies in me." The death of Nero, after the first outbursts of joy with which it was greeted, soon aroused conflicting feelings not only among the senators, the people, and the soldiers in the city, but also among the generals and their troops abroad. It had divulged a secret of state. An emperor could be made elsewhere than at Rome.
Professor Gwyn Morgan succinctly sums up the events leading to Galba becoming emperor as a series of accidents. Had Vindix's revolt not looked like a Gallic insurrection, the legions from both Germanias would not have been drawn into the conflict, nor would Vindix have felt the need to reach out to Galba. Similarly, had Galba not assumed the leadership of the revolt, the legions of the Rhine frontier were unlikely to have attempted to install Virginius as emperor. And finally, had there been less uncertainty about the motives and prospects of Galba and Virginius alike, Nero might still have panicked, but Nymphidius would have been much less tempted to take the action that completed the ruin of the imperial house. And with the death of the artist, the Julio-Claudian dynasty was no more. Instead, an aged politician named Galba, who was still nowhere near Rome, was its new emperor. But the empire was in for a bumpy ride.